Hard to believe that Sauber as an entity has been around for over 50 years, even though the Formula 1 team has been around since the early 1990s. Most companies or teams don't last that long, especially ones that are just simply, well, privateers. In Formula 1, Sauber is the fourth longest serving team behind Ferrari, McLaren and Williams. But what about Mercedes? Well, there's quite a gap between 1955 and 2010, 45 years as it so happens. But to think that Sauber and Williams have lasted as long as they have simply because of the cutthroat nature of Formula 1. Williams is now in the hands of new owners after the Williams family sold up a few years back, and to Dorilton's credit, they are focused on keeping that name alive, even if they are having to go through quite the modernisation program at the minute. Spreadsheets, etc. But where does that leave Sauber in the longest international teams then? Because if you go before Sauber's F1 exploits, surely they have to be on the same list as the likes of, well, McLaren, Ferrari and Williams, but also Dick Johnson Racing in V8 supercars, the Wood brothers in NASCAR, and Penske in everything. And add to this, there are teams that Sauber has outlived in Formula 1 despite those teams coming in long before them and after them. Lotus, Tyrrell, Minardi, Honda, Toyota, Jordan and so on, with a couple of those teams having access to much bigger checkbooks than Sauber ever did. And yes, there was the buyout from BMW, but Peter was able to get the team back at the end. Now though, 2025 will be the last season that a team called Sauber will be on the grid, as it transitions into becoming Audi in time for 2026, meaning that we will lose one of the long-standing names and a privateer that always managed to stick around while others fell. Okay, there have been other owners, but still, Sauber is a privateer name. So today, why not look back at where it all began? Because Sauber, in a way, ended up giving Formula 1 one of its biggest ever names. Sauber's start in motorsport came from an unlikely source. I say it's unlikely, but it started with little more than taking a massive punt on things. Peter Sauber sold the family business, which manufactured traffic lights of all things, so that he could raise the money to start building hill climb cars in the Swiss Hill Climb Championship. In 1970, he designed and built the first prototype, the C1, with the C on all the Sauber cars from now until 2025 being called the C something because of his wife, Christine. It was quite the cobbled together machine, with Peter welding the tubular space frame himself and the engine being a 1 litre 115 horsepower Cosworth 4-cylinder, with the suspension parts supplied by Brabham. And Peter actually raced this car as well, winning the 1970 Swiss Sports Car Championship. Although given the attitudes towards racing by the Swiss since the 1955 Le Mans disaster, I don't think any of the events actually took place in Switzerland. And I can't find that much information about it, but I think, at least, well, what I can gather at least, is that these races were hill climb, circuit and slalom races. Interesting. The C2 followed in 1971, which had a larger, more powerful engine and won 3 races and took several podiums. Looks a bit bulky from this picture, but the car had 240 horsepower and only weighed 480 kilos. It doesn't sound like a lot, but the power to weight must have been immense. Now I'm no maths or mechanical engineering guy, but in terms of power to weight, you've got to be in Caterham territory. Yeah, one of the supercharged ones. And you know what? Let's have a look at that, since I'm curious. 240 horsepower from a 480 kilogram car is 500 brake horsepower per tonne. The Caterham 7 Superlight with the supercharged Ford Duratec engine and a car that won the Top Gear Car of the Year in 2008 is 517 kilos with a 263 horsepower engine. Popping that into the calculator gives us 508 horsepower. So yeah, pretty much in that ballpark. It must have gone like shit off a shovel. Peter developed the cars further, bringing the C3 and the C4 to the various championships around Switzerland and Europe, and in every single year he won at least one race with his cars. But for 1977 he took a step up, because Group 6 was a thing at Le Mans, and there was an opportunity there to have a go. And why not test things at the most prestigious 24-hour race of them all? Group 6 is what was around before Group C, so patience, Group C fans, we're getting towards the good stuff. Group 6, at least when it was originally introduced, was basically no minimum build required, and they could bring whatever they wanted so long as it met the weight, dimension and a couple of other restrictions that were placed on them. Now this category was introduced in 1966, so the same year that Ford took their historic first victory at Le Mans, and it lasted until 1982 when Group C came round. So what did the Ford fall into then? Well, as a quick one to just allow some clarity, because Well, at the time the FIA groups were all over the place, the Ford GT that won in 1966 was in the 2 litre to 7 litre prototype Group 6 category. The GTs from the previous years were in Group 3, and sports cars were as they had been in 1965, Group 4. Yeah, I don't get it either. It's a bit like rallying in the 80s. Group B was the top category and the fastest category, but Group A, which sounds like it should be faster, was slower. They really didn't streamline the categories back then like they do now. There's now at least a clear tier system in place. Calling the top category Hypercar tells you all you have to know, and then LMP2, GTE, GT3, TCR, and so on and so on and so on and so on. But yeah, this period of racing is mad. But if you think that's crazy, wait until you see how they chopped and changed GT1 around. Oh wait, I've already done that one, haven't I? But in 1976, Group 6 was back, but its official name was two-seater racing cars. As the name suggests, the cars had to be sports cars with 2 seats, something that has remained in place at Le Mans and the World Sports Car or World Endurance Championship even today. The cars don't have to have 2 seats these days, they just have to be built so that a second seat can be fitted. So to translate, no McLaren F1 style middle of the car driving position, you have to be sat on the left or the right. The correct side. So Sauber built his new C5 with help from fellow Swiss engineer Eddie Weiss, I think that's how it's pronounced, who had joined him to build the C4. Eddie had helped Peter construct the all-new chassis since his current one was starting to get old and he needed something that he could use to keep up with everything and everybody else. The C5 was completed in time for the 1975 racing season and was on the outside and inside totally different to the previous Saubers. It was less stubby and Can-Am-like and more aerodynamic, much like the 917K, and was developed with Le Mans in mind. Sauber built 5 of these cars for themselves and for customers, and Herbert Muller had already won the Interserie trophy with it. Now, Interserie is an interesting series. What it does is it allows for cars that are obsolete in other categories and other series to just turn up and race, and they get put into different categories. So maybe you have like an older BTCC car from like, I don't know, 2016, which cannot run today in the sort of more updated BTCC, but it can race over there. So if you own a racing car, you can still race it, somewhere. The C5 would take on the 24 Hours of Le Mans in 1977. It was powered by the 4-cylinder BMW M12 engine, but unlike the 1200 horsepower hand grenades that ran in Formula 1 in the mid-1980s, which were also called the M12, well, M12/13, this one was naturally aspirated and still produced 300 horsepower, a step up from the previous Ford engines that he'd been running before. But the Sauber C5 entered into Le Mans retired with gearbox issues, but had led its class for a time. The same problem hit them when they entered again in 1978, and the gearbox rebuild took them so long and they lost so many laps, they weren't classified because they hadn't completed 70% of the race distance, missing out by just 2 laps. But in 1982, the regulations changed, giving the world probably the most beloved sports cars of all time, Group C. The last time I looked at this era, I looked at the Jags. Before that, I did the 956, and I also looked at That Lap by Stefan Beloff at the Nürburgring, which was basically Stefan completing motorsport, and a lap that will never be beaten for some, because the only cars that can go faster now aren't doing it over a race weekend. But Group C was a big reset for the FIA, merging the Group 6 2-seater prototype classes and the GTP category. And while they had used engine displacement caps before, they were now creating a fuel efficiency formula. 100 litre tanks, 5 fuel stops over a 1,000 kilometre race, and encouraged fuel saving and efficiency over outright grunt and power. Utter woke nonsense. But this wasn't a bad thing because manufacturer interest was massive. It meant, much like with GT3 and BOP today, manufacturers could run their signature engines. Jag used V12s, Porsches used inline 6s with turbos, and so on. Proper endurance stuff. And Sauber's entry into this was the rather striking SHS C6, with SHS being the engineering firm Seeger and Hoffman who helped Peter get things sorted out so they could enter the 1982 WEC. Even though it wasn't called the WEC at the time, it was called the World Sports Car Championship, but I'm calling it WEC just for simplicity. And probably the most unique thing about the car was the rear wing, called the whale tail, that produced some of the rear downforce. And this was attached to the bodywork by, well, not so much a pillar, but attached to, well, I guess a mini shark fin, while other manufacturers went with end plates that joined up with the bodywork on the left and rear corners. The season started slow. The 1,000 kilometres of Monza, the car had a fuel pump problem, and then at the Deutsche Rennsportmeisterschaft race at the Nürburgring, it crashed, but was then able to take 13th at Silverstone, which scored it some points. It didn't finish the first Group C Le Mans, but managed to finish 7th at the Nürburgring and 4th at Hockenheim in DRM, and then 9th at the 1,000 kilometres of Spa before finishing 5th at Mugello. Sauber finished 6th in the Constructors in the WEC that year. And then the following year, the Sauber would be the odd one out on that Porsche ad. Nobody's perfect. 9 Porsches, but just the one Sauber BMW. But by this point, the car would be upgraded to a 3.5 litre BMW M88 engine. But there would be no C7, at least not competitively. But in 1985, Sauber teamed up with Mercedes for the first time, and the C8 would be the car on the grid instead. Powered by the Mercedes M117 V8, which had 2 turbos attached, it produced a whopping 700 horsepower of, power, while weighing 870 kilos. The car was built in time for Le Mans, but a massive accident involving John Nielsen totaled the car completely, and it never even started. For Sauber and Mercedes, it wasn't what they wanted. Not only was Mercedes' name back at Le Mans since 1955, so 30 years since that day, it had been involved in a big accident before things had even begun. Mercedes must have felt like they were cursed, and Sauber had to sit out the rest of the season because of that accident, because, well, they had no car left. At the 1986 Nürburgring 1,000 kilometres, Sauber got their breakthrough win, and it encouraged Mercedes to stick around a little bit longer. So for 1987, they had a new car, the C9. Part of the way Peter had secured the supply and funding deal was by asking Mercedes if he could put his car in their wind tunnel, and Mercedes were impressed enough to go through with it. Starting as supplier only, interest increased from Mercedes when Quiros Racing, owned by Yves Saint Laurent, didn't renew the sponsorship deal. In turn, it became Sauber Mercedes for 1988 and were the Mercedes factory team now. 5 wins came in 1988, finishing second to the mighty Jags, but for Le Mans in 1988, Sauber didn't turn up again, this time because of safety concerns involving their Michelin tyres. Mercedes must have really thought they were cursed by this point. But 1989 was the turning point. The cars were now in the traditional Mercedes silver and now had this 5-litre turbo V8 under the bonnet that equated to an 8.5-litre engine if it was naturally aspirated. And the drivers that Mercedes were putting in that car would be, for the most part, names you might recognise. Mauro Baldi, Jean-Louis Schlesser, Kenny Atchison, I think that's how it's pronounced, and Jochen Mass. Every single one of those drivers raced in Formula 1 at some point. And the car dominated the season. At least one of them ended up on the podium at every race that year, taking wins at Suzuka, Jarama, Brands, Nürburgring, Donington, Spa and Mexico, with the Suzuka, Nürburgring and Donington rounds being a 1-2. But at Le Mans, things got even better still. 248 miles per hour. That's the speed that the Atchison, Baldi and Brancatelli car achieved in qualifying for that race. Not the fastest that anybody has been by any stretch, because there was that Project 400 car powered by the Peugeot engine that hit 252 the year before. But this car was more than just let's see if we can do it. This did 248 miles an hour, or 400 kilometers an hour, and lasted the whole race. Came second, while the sister car won, beating the Jags and the Porsches. The curse of Mercedes at Le Mans seemed to be lifted. While it was Baldi's car that registered the top speed, it was the other car of Mass, Manuel Reuter and Stanley Dickens that won it. Mercedes was now back at the top of motorsport, and it had been a while coming. Remember, they had withdrawn from motorsport entirely following what happened at the 1955 24 Hours of Le Mans, and the crash almost got motorsport banned in France until the circuits could prove that they'd increased the safety. Scoring a 1-2 was a big return to the top, and to do it at Le Mans was symbolic, as well as being a kick in the face to Jag and Porsche. And even though this is supposed to be the video of how Sauber went from little upstart in Switzerland to making it through sports cars and then into Formula 1, I do at some point have to dedicate an entire video to the C9 and maybe the C11 as well, simply because they were absolute monsters. But Sauber didn't stop with the C9, because the C11 was to come next. Powered by the same engine, Mercedes was keen to take advantage of the previous year's success, and the cars were now Sauber Mercedes and not just Sauber, even though they were Sauber powered by Mercedes the year before. Still in the silver colours, the 11 looked more advanced and more menacing than before, especially with those vents over the front wheels, which are still used today on the modern cars to prevent air building up in there and causing backflips, Peter Dunbreck style. And Sauber had managed to make gains on the front end, much like I do after Christmas, to produce around 26.2 kilonewtons of downforce at the front end, while travelling at 200 miles an hour, about 4.5 up on what was there on the C9. So why did they jump from C9 to C11? Well, apparently it's because saying C11 in German doesn't translate particularly well, or it's not very comfortable to say. C10? I mean, that doesn't sound so difficult, but it is what it is. C10, not C11. C10. C10? Is that how you say it? And once again, the C11 and Mercedes dominated the World Sports Car Championship, winning at Monza, Spa, Dijon, the Nürburgring, Donington, Montreal and Mexico, albeit with a couple of disqualifications. But what is telling is the amount of 1-2s they had that year. They had Porsche and Jag's number that year, and Martin Brundle had said that the Jag could keep up with the Sauber when the Jag was driven flat out, but the Mercedes could maintain the pace for much longer because it had more downforce. And Brundle also said that Mercedes drivers, or Sauber's drivers, were much better. On top of this, Schlesser was able to make his fuel last longer than everybody else while maintaining pace, which meant faster fuel stops. They retained the championship, but they didn't retain the Le Mans victory, simply because they never bothered to enter, because Le Mans that year didn't count for the World Sports Car Championship. The following year it would be back on, and at the same time, Sauber had a little academy of drivers, an academy that contained 3 drivers in particular who went on to bigger things. It has to be said that one of those drivers left quite the mark on motorsport. In the number 2 car in 1990 were 3 young drivers, 2 Germans and 1 Austrian. They basically rotated round as second driver to Jochen Mass, who was by far the more experienced driver, and they were part of Mercedes' young driver programme and gaining experience with Sauber's Group C prototypes. The Austrian was Karl Wedlinger, while the 2 Germans were Heinz-Harald Frentzen and some kid from Herth called Schumacher. And this was quite odd on Sauber and Mercedes' end, because most of the other drivers who were up and coming at this point, like Mika Hakkinen, Olivier Panis, Eddie Irvine, Alex Zanardi, David Brabham, Gianni Morbidelli and so on, were all in Formula 3 or Formula 3000, taking a much straighter line towards Formula 1. While the 3 Sauber drivers would race at Macau, with Schumacher taking a somewhat controversial win in 1990, sticking them in sports cars was a bit of a sidestep. But for Schumacher, this was seen as being a way of improving his concentration. If he could keep it up for an endurance race in those Group C weapons, then Formula racing would be easier. After dominating 1990, 1991 was going to be the nail in the coffin for Sauber, Mercedes and, well, Group C as a whole, because the controversial 3.5 litre engine formula had been brought in. It was kind of designed to help bridge the gap between Formula 1 and Group C endurance, but, well, it had the opposite effect. Sauber and Mercedes just could not get it right. Sauber now had to build a car that functioned well at every track, and while Jag was able to build a car that was pretty effective at every track, the Sauber was very much a Le Mans merchant with a low drag design. On top of this, Mercedes had to build a 3.5 litre naturally aspirated engine that had to rev higher than what they'd been using before, and they just couldn't figure out the construction. The end result was they only scored a second place at Silverstone and then won the final round at Autopolis in Japan, with Schumacher behind the wheel. Group C was about to meet its end. It would die completely in 1992. But with Mercedes sitting on a 3.5 litre engine, it made sense for both Sauber and Mercedes to switch to Formula 1. But while Sauber was pretty keen, Mercedes, not so. Mercedes didn't want to be in F1 as their own team, but were still willing to supply engines built by Ilmor but badged as Sauber to help keep things a little more under wraps. Probably so Mercedes could see where things were going and then go, hey, we built those engines, aren't we great? But another reason Mercedes wasn't so keen is because they'd seen other manufacturers try to go into Formula 1 in recent years with little to no success. Lamborghini had come and gone, Subaru tried to revive the Flat 12 with hilarious results, and a small company called Simtech had designed and built a car for BMW, but BMW never bothered to go through with it. But that Simtech car built for BMW would actually make it to the 1992 Formula 1 season. It had been purchased by a shoe salesman from Italy. If you know, you know. But at the start of 1993, Sauber was in Formula 1, and 2 of their drivers were in the sport. Wendlinger was making his debut while Schumacher had been there for a couple of years. Frentzen would make his debut the following year because the other driver at Sauber in 1993, JJ Leto, had moved to Benetton. A steady stream of points through 1993 convinced Mercedes to come back to Formula 1 properly, moving from Sauber later on to McLaren to their own team. their own team that had the most dominant Constructors' Championship run in history. And for Sauber, it was the start of a 32 or 33 year run in Formula 1. They stuck around while the likes of Jordan and Minardi went broke. Sauber managing to do deals with Ferrari to take on parts and engines much like Haas does today, probably helping them with that. And in turn, Sauber has helped bring in a fair few long-serving names into Formula 1. Kimi Räikkönen, Charles Leclerc, Felipe Massa and Sergio Perez, to name quite literally some. And as mentioned, this will be Sauber's last year in Formula 1 before it becomes Audi in 2026. Which means we'll be left with just Williams. It's going to be weird not seeing Sauber around, isn't it? So then, a look at Sauber's sports car years and how that led them towards Formula 1. If this has been a good look through the motorsport history books, then do give the video a like so I know I've done a good job. And for more from this channel, make sure you get subscribed and also get that bell on so you never miss out on anything else I do around here. Massive thanks as ever go out to the fine bunch of lads over at Patreon for the continued support, and if you want to help pay the bills around here, a link to Patreon will be in the description, along with links to Discord, socials, affiliates and other bits and pieces you might want or need to know. Well, there's super thanks if you just want to top up my coffee cup, and memberships for Patreon without the Patreon. So until next time, I've been Aidan, have a great day wherever you are, and goodbye.